Well, good morning and welcome to the Well. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Danny. I'm one of the pastors here at our church. I just want to add my welcome on top of those you've received today, whether it was from Philippe or from Sadie or from someone when you walked in. We're just glad you're here, especially if it's your first time. It does take a lot of courage to come and to try a new church. We know that that's something that we don't take for granted, just to get out of your car and to make the choice to go somewhere. And so we're honored that you would make that choice to come and to check out what we're doing here, whether you've been thinking about it for months, days, weeks, or whatever it did to get you to this place. We're just happy that you're here. And as Philippe said, we're in this sermon series beginning again. We've been looking at second chances and what God gives us in second chances and how we receive second chances. As Philippe said, and I think that's interesting, like growing up in America, like I don't always think of America as a place of second chances. Sometimes I feel like when I fail, I'm held to that standard. But as someone that immigrated here, seeing like, hey, this is a place of like great second chances. That's like something quite interesting to see how our perception impacts our reality and how we perceive the things that are around us. But I think it's quite interesting, and I think many of us would say like this is a place of opportunity and a place of second chances in many ways. And we want to explore how our faith ought to be the same way. And so we're going to be looking at a story today, maybe a famous one if you grew up in church. Maybe you've never heard it before. All the same, it's going to be interesting for us to dive into. But it explores the conversion of a guy named Paul, formerly known as Saul. We know him as the Apostle Paul. He wrote a lot of the New Testament letters. We're going to be looking at his conversion. But before we get into the story, I want to tell a quick story about my middle daughter, Josephine. So she is now a third grader. She's 8 years old. She'll be 9 in April. And I remember she came home from school one day, and we were sitting at the table, and she started telling us about this field trip that she went on to the zoo. And she was, with great detail, telling this field trip about the frog she saw and all these things. And she was actually explaining to us, like we were the only parents, my wife and I, that weren't chaperones. Every single parent was there except for us. And that she was the only one without a lunch, that they had to bring her one, and so they packed her one. And we were like blown away because we had no idea there was a field trip on this day. It just like completely bored. So we're like emailing the teachers. We're like, hey, how did we miss this? Like, was this our fault? Was this your guys' fault? Like, it sounds like this was the most dope field trip that it has ever happened in the history of school. And so, like, how can we make sure we get that? Come to find out, my daughter, like, lied about the entire thing. Like, she created this amazingly complex story about the things she saw and the emotions that she felt about being left out. Like, think of the imaginative capacity to imagine a field trip and then go down the rabbit trail of like, but what would happen if I was the only one that didn't have this? And I was the only one that didn't have a parent there. And so she tells this whole story. And we use this as a teachable moment for our daughter to talk about the importance of telling the truth and the importance of trust. But we also use it to tell her, like, you know, like we trust you, we believe you, and we love you. But there is a little bit of like rebuilding that has to happen, right? Like we have to rebuild that trust. Like we want to believe you, but now when you tell me you did your homework, who knows what happened, right? Like it's hard for me to know these things, right? So we had to rebuild this trust. And I think when we think about like things changing in our lives, especially spiritually, like we think about the new things that are in front of us, right? And I think about the Apostle Paul story. Like, if you've never heard the story, he's like walking down this road and he's blinded by this light, who is Jesus, and Jesus speaks to him and tells him, like, hey, I want you to stop persecuting Christians and I want you to come to join the way of Jesus, paraphrasing a little bit. And then, like, he goes and he becomes a part of this way of Jesus. But something that I don't think we ever really talk about, at least in my experience, didn't spend a lot of time talking about, was like, what do we have to do with the trust rebuilding with the people that were once terrified of this guy named Paul? And if you don't know anything about the Apostle Paul, like he was one of the most like zealous, accomplished, and feared by Christians Jewish leaders. He was getting letters from the Jewish religion, the synagogues around, saying, go to this place and go to that city and go to this area and this region. I want you to seek out men, women, and children who are a part of the way of Jesus, and I want you to arrest them, imprison them, and if you need to, kill them. And so Paul did not have this great reputation. And so I think about this, right? Like he's blinded on this road. He meets Jesus, and he's then connected with this other person named Ananias who takes him in and heals him and helps him see again. And then we have this kind of joining of the movement, and it goes into him preaching, and he does all these things. And like when I'm reading this story, it almost goes so fast that I'm like, what happened? Like this guy hurt some people. Like this guy damaged some people irreparably, probably, right? People that are like, I don't want to be in the same space with this person. Like, if you've ever been hurt by someone, like sharing space with that person is very hard. Like, if you've ever been really, really dramatically hurt by someone, like think Apostle Paul level hurt, like in the name of religion, and this person believes he's doing right. And that's what, we don't always give Paul the most credit. Like, Paul did believe he was doing the right thing, like I would suppose, like he believes he's doing the right thing, but he's misguided in what he's doing. He's hurting all of these people. So then to share space with those people, like imagine what that would have been like to sit next to the person that was the face of your harm, the face of religious trauma, the face of all of these things that were ultimately a negative experience in your life. Imagine seeing that. That would have been really, really hard. And so as much as I want to kind of explore Paul's story as his second chance, I want to explore, I think, an interesting part of this is the rebuilding of the bridges that are burned as we experience transformation in our life. Like as we receive a second chance, like God does something quite profound in our stories, right? God does something for us that gives us a second chance, gives us a new lease on life, gives us a new future, a new path forward. But also, like, what happens to all of the people that were hurt in our past? What happens to the people that were intentionally hurt in our past or unintentionally hurt in our past? Like, how do we reconcile that, and how do we navigate that? And I think to embrace second chances for us, I think God gives us an opportunity to rebuild trust with God, with others, with neighbors, and rebuild that around it. So I want to look at this story. And so if you have your Bibles, you want to open the Well 636 app. We're not going to have sermon slides today, but we can be within our Bibles or the app. We're going to be in Acts chapter 9. And we're going to jump around a little bit. And this story, again, it follows kind of the introduction of Saul. And so I'll read it here for you in 9 verses 1 through 2. It says, "Meanwhile, Saul was still spewing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples." So it's like, he's not doing super sweet things, right? Like people are not psyched about this guy. Murderous threats out to the people that are part of the way of Jesus. And he went to the high priest seeking letters in the synagogue in Damascus. And if he found a person who belonged to the way, whether men or women, these letters would authorize him to take them prisoners to Jerusalem. And so Paul is wandering around. He's going into these different regions. He's walking in. He has these like letters that are giving him authority to walk into these places, to go and to take people as prisoners. And he's, again, going about his faith in a way that I think for him feels genuine. I think for him feels like he's like, I mean, if you sat down with him the day before his conversion, and he's talking to his greatest colleague, they're talking about how they're doing the Lord's work, right? They're stomping out heresy, and they're stomping out people that are trying to water down and belittle the way that God is planned for them. I think they genuinely believe that they're doing the Lord's work. But as Jesus often does, like gets a hold of them and shows them that there's a little bit of the error of the way. So it continues in the story. It says that he, while walking on this road, he's blinded by this light. And in verse 4, it says he falls to the ground, and he heard a voice asking him, "Saul, Saul, why are you harassing me?" And Saul asked, "Well, who are you, Lord?" Which is interesting. Like, it seems to be that he knows that this is the Lord. Like, that's an interesting thing to say. Like, he says, "Who are you?" And then he names the person. And that's quite interesting to me, because Jesus often asks, like, well, who do you say I am? And who do you say the Lord is, right? And he's like asking him, he's like, you worship God, but I don't know that you know that I am the Lord. Like, I'm the guiding part of your life. And he says, well, who are you and who is the Lord? Like, who is God? Like, you could manifest this and think about this in many different ways. But he asks this, who are you? And he says, I am Jesus, the one whom you are harassing. Now get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you must do. And so everyone around is like terrified, as you would be. Like, blinding light, the guy that's like leading your way is now blinded. He hears you talking to someone that they can't quite see. Like, this is one of the weirdest experiences I've ever been a part of. And then he's ushered off to this other community to hang out with this guy named Ananias. And Ananias is a part of the way of Jesus. He's someone that is one of the disciples, one of the early apostles, someone that's leading the way of Jesus. And Jesus in this story comes to Ananias and he says, there's this guy named Saul, and I want you to help him. And Ananias is like, yeah, I've heard of him. Like, he's killing my friends. Like, this is someone that is the enemy. Like, why would you want this person to come into my space? Why would you want this person to come into my area? This person, again, if I stand next to them, I will feel every negative feeling I've ever felt about religion, about fear, about anything. Like, you're putting me in the space and not just telling me to share space with this person, you're telling me that I should help this person. But then he go back and forth, Ananias and Jesus in this. Eventually Ananias is like, all right, I'm gonna help this guy. He tells him in verse 15, the Lord says, go and tell this man that he is the agent that I have chosen to bear my name to the Gentiles, to the kings, and to all of the Israelites. And so he comes in, Ananias prays over this guy. It says scales fall from his eyes. He can see again. He's restored all these things. And I imagine when it's he can see, it's not just visual sight. There's spiritual sight. And there are times probably we felt spiritually blinded, whether by anger, by frustration, by our own hurt. I imagine Ananias was probably blinded in certain ways, right? He did not want to help Paul at all, right? He's probably blinded by that. So he's blinded, and then he gets some vision added back, spiritual, but also actual vision. And then it says that he spent some time, starting in verse 18, that with the disciples, he spends time with these people, he gets baptized and regains his strength. And it says he stayed with the disciples in Damascus for several days. But then right away, starting in verse 20, he begins preaching about Jesus in the synagogues, declaring that he is Jesus is the Son of God. That would have been jarring, right? Because there was no Twitter, right? There was no Facebook or TikTok. So news was not spreading like wildfire that Saul had been changed, right? There were people that were hearing rumblings that this Saul guy might show up and kill them. And then they show up at church that day and they're like, he's the preacher? That's what's happening here, right? This is the person, and he's preaching not that they're doing anything wrong, but he's preaching that they are the people that are actually correct in this. The person that was coming to persecute them, coming to imprison them, maybe coming to kill them, is now preaching not only has my heart been changed, but you guys are actually in the right because you worship the true God in Jesus. And then it says the crowd is baffled in verse 21. And they're in the crowd, they're chatting with each other. And they're like, isn't this the guy that was wreaking havoc among us in Jerusalem, who called out his name? Hadn't he come here to take the same people prisoners to the chief priest? And so it goes back and forth, and he's preaching here, and people are kind of in the stadium, in the synagogue, and they're like, oh, this is kind of weird. This is kind of interesting. But it says that they grew stronger and stronger in their faith, that Saul grew stronger and stronger in his faith, and that God continued to add to the number of people that were being saved. But it also says, if you go down to verse 25, that people are trying to kill him. He's preaching this good news, and they're still we don't buy it. We're not interested in this Saul guy. He's saying the right things. He's walking the right walk. He's doing the right things. His fruit maybe looks like it's good fruit of the Lord, but we're not really sure that we buy it. We're not really sure that we believe that this is the person that he now says he is. And so they sneak him out by night. They lower baskets. They get him their food. They get him outside the city walls because they can't bring him in because they're like, if we bring him in here, he's dead meat. We're going to get this. He's going to be killed, right? And then they bounce around between Jerusalem. They go to Caesarea. They go to Tarsus. They go to all of these different areas, going back around. And he is continually convincing people that he is who he is. He is who he says he is. Now, I gave you kind of the rundown of this story in short. And we haven't done this in a long time, but we have a full room and a lot of new faces in the room. And so why not add to that excitement with some conversation? And so one of the things we often do here at The Well, and if you're new, you're like, this sounds like my nightmare, because I can already see where this is going. And so if you're someone that's a regular, help ease the tension for any of our new friends in town. But sometimes we have conversations, and I ask us just to have a little bit of chatting with one another. So I want you to put yourself in this situation. As one of the people in the synagogue, maybe you're a periphery person in the community, you see Saul wandering around, I want you to just, with brutal and blunt honesty, share what your feeling would be. If you rolled into church that Sunday and you saw Saul in the pulpit, or you're walking around the market and you see him walking around, you're like, that's that dude. He's gonna kill me. Right? What would your emotions be? So maybe turn to 1, 2, 3 people around you. If you don't know them, please introduce yourself. We'll take about a minute to talk and then we'll come back together. What would be your emotions if you saw Paul in real life? So I imagine the general prevailing consensus was I'd turn the other way, maybe, if I saw him, or maybe someone's like, I'd hug him. He looks like he needs a hug, right? I don't know. I imagine there's some diversity of thought, but I imagine a lot of it maybe is grounded in this would be somewhat terrifying for me, right? And I think that's something worth processing, because let's get into the mind of Paul for a second, Saul Paul. He experiences nothing other than like Jesus got a hold of my life. Like his life was transformed, right? Like he experiences nothing other than like, oh my gosh, I see the error of my ways. I was completely doing the wrong thing. I was persecuting and killing and imprisoning the people that ultimately were the people that I should be caring about the most, that are a part of my new family. And so for him walking around, he's like, I see the error of my ways. But in real life experience, he's like, I don't get why no one believes me, right? Like, I don't get why no one understands, right? And I mean, we all looking back and reading the story, like, well, we get it. You were kind of a nightmare, right? Like you did some terrible things. But what's interesting, and again, like we look at this story and we look at it as an amazing story of Paul's transformation. But one of the things, and I tried to like hit on this as we went through this, but it likely was missed. There were tons of different regions that he went to in this process. And I asked myself, like, well, why was this going? And as you dive into like any sort of like extra biblical kind of work being done historically or theologically, like Paul was going around and he was righting wrongs and making amends, and they're taking him to different places so that he can meet other leaders and they can make apologies and he can make his case to say, like, I am actually no longer the person that you remember me to be or you have heard that I am. Like he can preach, I'm transformed, till he's blue in the face, right? But they want to see that the bridges that he burned are now being mended. The bridges that he's burned are being rebuilt for passages for people to walk freely in relationship with him and with one another. When I think about transformation for any of us and for all of us, like there is an amazing true reality that God can and will get a hold of any of our hearts and transform any story like Saul's, right? Like if we feel like we are irredeemable, we are on the bad guy team, we're going the opposite direction, we've done irredeemable things, and Saul did some pretty like abhorrent and bad things, right? Like if you put people on the Mount Rushmore of irredeemable, he would be close to that list, right? But God transforms his story nonetheless, which I think is an amazing testimony to the threshold of what God can do. But what Paul did not get permission to do in the ability to be transformed was do the work of reconciling broken relationships and do the work of rebuilding and mending the bridges that were burned and tore down. I remember there was a podcast that came out on a famous church in the Pacific Northwest that grew up very big and then kind of imploded due to some leadership issues. And the pastor of this church famously said that if you like weren't on the bus with me, you were going to be run over by the bus because we're going where we're going, right? That's a mentality of saying like, I'm not rebuilding in the bridges, right? Like if you're not on my team, you're against me. If you're not with me, you're against me. And what's interesting is this story that we read in Acts chapter 9 is like the opposite story, right? Like Jesus is like, you are transformed, but God uses Ananias and other disciples and just the conviction of the Holy Spirit to say, we're going to go and we're going to take you to these different places and we're going to let you preach. And we're going to let you work out verbally and through telling your story what God has done in your life. But also I'm going to put you face to face with the people that are the most hurt by you. I'm going to put you face to face with the people that are the most scared of you. I'm going to put you face to face with the people that you can no longer otherize or put into a hypothetical, the people that you disagreed with or hurt. I'm going to make you reconcile with these people. And what I find to be the most interesting is that, like, he finds reconciliation, right? Like, he finds that. He becomes one of the biggest leaders in the church. And going back to, and I've said this many times, like, when I read Scripture, I often, like, see things new that, like, I never noticed before. And sometimes I think I make connections that maybe aren't there. And sometimes I think I make connections that are there. And so you can decide if this is that or not. But as I was reading back in the beginning of verse 9, it says, that he found, if he found a person who belonged to the way of Jesus, whether men or women, the letters that he received would authorize him to take them as prisoners as his own to Jerusalem. And what I thought was interesting is Paul went from someone that was like carrying out the orders of letters that were written to him on behalf of the church to go and to hurt people, to imprison people, and to murder people. And then he went on to author all of the letters that we read as the church. Like, that is quite interesting to me, right? Like, he was given in writing letters from the church saying, go and do these things, these terrible, abhorrent acts that are going to tear people down, that are going to hurt people, that are going to marginalize people. then went on to author like a huge chunk of our New Testament letters that we read. He is the author of those, and he went on to write those letters. Again, I think an amazing testament to the threshold of God's grace and God's impact in our lives. And so if I was giving you what I think like the biggest challenge for today is, it would be this, that you might be in the seat of Saul or Paul, someone that feels like you have done so much that is impossible to redeem. Someone that feels like you are on the other side and perhaps the wrong side of history, the person that has made all the choices that you feel like have excluded you from the circle. Just like Paul's story, I think that you are equally invited back in, and the threshold and capacity for transformation in your life is unlimited. Like every story that we've explored so far in this, like God has a plan and a story, and it's not about first chances or second chances or third chances, but we worship a God in Jesus of unlimited opportunities and unlimited chances. So if you're someone that's sitting in that place, I would continually remind you that there is nothing that you could do to move yourself out of the way and the grace of Jesus and the potential for his story to transform your life. Now, on the other side of that, I would say that perhaps you've experienced that transformation, like you've come to terms with that, like you've received it. There's probably some work of amends that needs to be done, right? Like going around and having conversations of who are the people that I've hurt in my life. I mentioned this a few Easters ago. My dad is a recovering alcoholic. He's been about 6 years sober, which is a wonderful thing to celebrate. But the biggest part for him was not finding sobriety, actually. He would find sobriety at several points in his journey. Every time it came to like mending the bridges that were broken, that was what would lead him back to drinking. He's like, I cannot apologize. I cannot accept this. Or I just like the shame is too much. Like maybe he felt very wrong. Like the shame was too big. And I would say like probably many of us sit in that space where we feel like there is the desire to rebuild those bridges. There's the desire to fix the things that have been hurt. But we wonder like, is God's grace big enough for that moment? Like, is God's grace big enough for what's happening there? And my challenge and my hope for you would believe that if we think Paul's story is true, if we think the stories that occupy this room are true, then the answer to that, I think, is unequivocally yes. That God's story isn't just enough to transform your life, but it's enough to begin to transform and heal relationships that were once broken by the life you once lived. And the last challenge is maybe you're like none of those things. Like I've been crushing it my whole life. Like maybe I've been on, like I'm always on the right side, which maybe challenge you to think maybe you weren't always on the right side, but maybe you are always on the right side. How can you be Ananias in this situation, right? Ananias, if you read the story, he was not psyched about helping Saul initially. And there's no point in this story where it ever says he is. It doesn't say he's like, you know what, God, you're right. But what he does say is like the work of reconciliation and grace and forgiveness and love and all the things that encapsulate the gospel are bigger than my own biases and dispositions, and I want to be a part of that work. Even if I don't fully understand it, even if I don't fully get it, like I want to be a part of that work of redemption, even if on its surface I don't get it, because I ultimately trust that God has a plan bigger than what I have. And so maybe you're in that seat of Ananias, and I would say, like, who is that person you can walk alongside that doesn't feel like anyone loves them, that feels like they don't have any grace left in the tank from anyone around them? Maybe there's someone that hurt you or they've hurt someone you love. Like maybe you can be the needed like healing balm and grace of God that can offer them a story that is bigger than their failures, a story that is bigger than the ways that they've messed up, and a story that actually invites them as well as you to see the totality and the fullness of the grace that God is offering each and every one of us. And that's my hope. Like that's the whole reason we do this story and do this series is not because they're super fun and easy stories to preach on, but because there are real life people that believe that God's grace is not big enough for them, that God's grace does not include them. And we want to be a church that's a part of inviting people into that sort of work, wherever they fall in their stories. And so with that in mind, would you pray with me? God, I do thank you that you're a God of first, second, third, and unlimited chances, that you continually invite us back into a relationship with you that is reminding us that it's not based on our actions, it's not based on our works, but it's based solely in your love and your grace. And so, God, I would ask that you would help us embrace and rest in your grace today, a grace that truly transforms us from the inside out, a grace that offers all of us stories greater than we could ever ask or imagine. And so, God, be with us, whether we resonate with Saul or Ananias or one of the passers-by that's just wondering what is going on. God, I just ask that you would help us wherever we are see first your love and view everything through the prism of your grace. We pray this all in Jesus' holy name. Amen.